Veni Creator Spiritus, mentes tuorum visita, in pleso pena gratia, quae tu creasti pectora.
And because his religion will be brotherhood without the fatherhood of God, he will deceive even the elect. He will set up a counter church, which will be the ape of the church, because he, the devil, is the ape of God. It will be the mystical body of the Antichrist that will in all externals resemble the church as the mystical body of Christ. In desperate need for God, he will induce modern man in his loneliness and frustration to hunger more and more for membership in his community that will give man enlargement of purpose without any need of personal amendment and without the admission of personal guilt.
Catholic tradition teaches us that the Mass is not an invention of man. It was established by Christ, who commanded his apostles to do this in memory of me. Although the traditional Latin Mass we have today was given to us by Christ, it does not look exactly as it did in the early church. Over the centuries, the church has developed rituals and prayers which she has added to enrich the Mass. However, it must be emphasized that with these changes, the church has always been very faithful in preserving the essential nature of the Mass as it was given to us by Christ. The Council of Trent holds that the canon of the Mass was composed partly of the very words of the Lord, partly of the traditions of the apostles, and also of the pious regulations of the holy pontiffs. The Church has the right to make legitimate adaptations to her liturgy. However, it is important to note that an accidental change, such as adding ceremonies to enrich the Mass, is far different than a substantial change that removes or alters part of the Mass to fit a changing theology. Attempts to make substantial changes to the holy sacrifice of the Mass are not a new development. There is always the temptation to change the substance of the Mass to please man. In the wake of the Protestant revolt, the holy sacrifice of the Mass was under attack. New Protestant liturgies were being introduced across Europe. These new liturgies contained both accidental and substantial changes. The altars were replaced with tables, the priest turned around to face the people, Latin was discarded in favor of the native language. They removed all the prayers that contained doctrinal concepts that did not fit their new theology, such as transubstantiation and the Mass as a sacrifice to atone for sin. Even the changes they introduced that did not, strictly speaking, affect the validity of the Mass were nevertheless made to deny some point of Catholic doctrine. For example, communion in the hand was introduced as a way of denying Christ's real presence in the Eucharist. There were even some Catholics who advocated changes to the Mass to appease the Protestants. To safeguard the Mass from the innovators who wanted to strip the Mass of its Catholic nature, Pope St. Pius V in 1570 fixed the Mass for all time in the papal bull Quo Primum. He writes in part that never at any time is anything to be added, subtracted, or changed in the Missal. This we determine and ordain to hold in perpetuity, that is, forever. After reading this bull, one would think the matter was settled. The Mass was never to be changed. Yet on April 4th, 1969, Paul VI issued his Novus Ordo Missae, or New Order of Mass, which he made obligatory for use in the Latin Rite. This new Mass was quite a shock to the Catholic world. There were those who objected to the new rite from the very beginning. In 1969, Cardinal Ottaviani and a group of Roman theologians wrote a short critical study of the New Order of Mass, which was called the Ottaviani Intervention. In this critical study, he observed that the New Order of Mass represents both as a whole and in its details a striking departure from the Catholic theology of the Mass as it was formulated in Session 22 of the Council of Trent. However, the voices of opposition were only a small minority, and in the end, most of the critics did come to accept the new Mass of Paul VI. There was good reason the Church had used the same rite of Mass for many centuries. So the obvious question to ask is, why was there suddenly a need to discard this ancient liturgy? The answer is ecumenism. The ecumenism of Vatican II was aimed at establishing a kind of fraternal union between Catholics and Protestants that did not involve conversion. This union would be based on emphasizing what was held in common and avoiding discussions of doctrinal differences. The traditional Latin Mass embodies the entire Catholic religion because it contains the entire teaching of Jesus Christ. The holy sacrifice of the Mass was therefore an obstacle to this new ecumenism. To the innovators of Vatican II, making the Mass more ecumenical meant removing those parts of the Mass to which the Protestants object. Archbishop Annibale Bognini was the secretary of the liturgical commission that created the new order of Mass. In a statement published in L'Osservatore Romano, Bognini tells us what the goal of the new Mass would be. He states, "We must strip from our Catholic prayers and from our Catholic liturgy everything which can be a stumbling block for our separated brethren." Pope Pius XII warned about the dangers of this new kind of ecumenism in his encyclical Humani Generis. He writes in part, "Another danger is perceived, which is all the more serious, because it is more concealed beneath a mask of virtue. There are many who, deploring disagreement among men and intellectual confusion, through an imprudent zeal for souls, are urged by a great and ardent desire to do away with the barrier that divides good and honest men. By setting aside questions which divide men, they aim not only at joining forces to repel the attacks of atheism, but also at reconciling things opposed to one another in the field of dogma. But some seem to consider as an obstacle to the restoration of fraternal union things founded on the laws and principles given by Christ, and likewise on institutions founded by him, or which are the defense and support of the integrity of the faith, and the removal of which would bring about union of all, but only to their own destruction. Some people have the false idea that the new Mass is just the old Mass translated into the native language. Nothing could be further from the truth. The new order of Mass is an entirely new creation with an entirely new theology to go along with it. The objections to the new Mass are not based on a reluctance to change or just a preference for Latin, but rather on questions of doctrine and validity. All the changes to the liturgy have one thing in common, that is, the deliberate removal of Catholic doctrine. In other words, they removed all the parts of the Mass that were too Catholic. The best way to demonstrate that the new rite of Mass is an entirely new creation is to compare the prayers of the two rites side by side. The new order of Mass contains a seemingly endless number of options, which does make a side-by-side comparison more difficult. This seemingly endless number of options in the new rite is an ecumenical feature that allows each priest to customize the service to accommodate the faith of any given assembly. Therefore, this comparison will focus mainly on the three principal parts of the Mass: the offertory, the consecration, and the communion. We know that the Mass is an immolative sacrifice, that is to say, the Mass is a renewal of the sacrifice of Calvary. This means that, like Calvary, it involves the sacrifice of a victim, and that victim is Jesus Christ. In the offertory, the victim is offered and the sacrifice is directed to a definite end. In the consecration, Christ becomes present on the altar. The communion represents the destruction of the victim in the sacrifice. Therefore, these three components, offertory, consecration, and communion, are all necessary to complete the sacrificial action. To fulfill the Sunday obligation of attending at Mass, the faithful must be present from the start of the offertory through the priest's communion. As each prayer is examined, ask yourself the question, would this prayer be acceptable to the Protestants before the change? Then, ask yourself, is the prayer acceptable to the Protestants after the change?
Tu septi formis monere, digitus paterne destere, turite promissum patris, sermone dictans futuro, ascende lumen sensibus, Augusten repellas longius, pacemque dones protinus, ductore sic te previo, vitemus omne noxium. Et esciamus da patrem, nascamus atque filium, teque utriusque spiritum, credamus omni tempore. Deo Patris sit gloria, et Filio